Hi, welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lynette Martins. I'm here with Scott Schweikert to speak with Professor Kayte Spector about the law and ethics of COVID-19 research. Before we begin, I'd like to just run through a few items. Thank you to those of you who sent in questions beforehand. If you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to use the Q&A tool to communicate with us. In the future, we're going to have, in about 2 weeks, on July 29th, we'll be hosting our final panel for this COVID-19 series. We'll be joined by more terrific panelists, Professor Rakia Yerby, Professor Seema Mohapatra, and Professor Ross Silverman on our public health webinar, specifically addressing issues of health equity and justice. So if you're just joining us, we're getting ready to speak with Professor Kayte Spector. She is the Assistant Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Michigan Medical School, where she is also the Chief of the Research Ethics Service in the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. Her research focuses on the secondary research use of health data, and her work has been funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute, National Cancer Institute, and the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. She has a wealth of experience as a former practicing biotech attorney and as Associate Director of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues under President Obama from the years 2010 to 2015. Many of you know her as a board member of ASBH, and we're super excited to have her join us today. She's going to speak to us about her experience at Michigan Medicine and will provide some key recommendations based on her research. Our gratitude to you, Kayte, for being here and taking the time to discuss this very important work.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Lynette and Scott. This is a really great opportunity, and the seminars so far have been really interesting, and I'm also really looking forward to the next one too. So this has been great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we have been doing at Michigan Medicine specifically, not in that we are perfect and that we have solved all the problems clearly, but just as an example of some of the issues we've struggled through and some of the at least interim solutions that we have come to. So as an overview, the three main issues that I'm going to focus on will be prioritizing clinical trials. So there has been some good work that has come out on that so far in terms of when an institution, I'm fine, it's just allergies. But when an institution has several different clinical trials that are proposed to be run at the same time, how do you prioritize that? The second issue I'm going to address is allocation of participants. So if you have more than one clinical trial and either a lot or not that many participants to enroll in them, how you make those decisions. And then the third topic that I'm going to address is doing all of this within the context of a really complex drug access structure and how that further compounds some of these issues as well as disparities. So first is just sort of general background. When COVID-19 came to Michigan in mid-March, we pretty much immediately set up 3 committees. So one of the first things that the institution did actually was send all of the researchers home. So we shut down human subjects research for trials that weren't therapeutic. And we shut down a lot of the lab research too, because it required people to be within 6 feet of each other in an enclosed space. And then we set up a new structure where we said, we are prioritizing COVID-related projects, and we set up, a research review committee. And the intent of the research review committee was that there were so many research proposals coming in from all of the researchers we had just sent home and stopped their projects that we actually needed a round of review before IRB, because we needed to prioritize the proposals for the IRB. I mean, as an example, I think on the first day we had 60 proposals. So it was quite complex. But we quickly found out that, so we had been reviewing proposals on a ranking scale But as they all came in, right? So we would rank the proposals as a day, and there was sort of no overarching comparison of the best proposals over a week or the best proposals over a month, right? They were only in comparison to each other. And we quickly realized that that, of course, might be fine for surveys and interviews, but didn't make any sense for clinical trials, because what we really needed to know were all of the clinical trials that were possible at our institution and be able to rank them against each other. So then we set up a second committee that was a trial prioritization committee that was actually able to sort of compare the trial proposals to each other. And then the trial prioritization committee would then make their recommendations to the feasibility review committee, who would then sort of assess what trials we can actually do. So the first was more of a scientific assessment of, is this a trial worth conducting? And then the feasibility review committee said, practically, can we actually do this? So two key research ethics issues that I'm going to address in the context of these questions, as I mentioned, are first, how did we actually determine which trials have the best chance of benefiting? And then how to establish a transparent and ethical process for subject recruitment. And I think Lynette sent out the link to the publication on this, but if you're interested in like very specific instruments in terms of ranking, it's all available at that link at the bottom of the slide. We have the appendixes and stuff, so you can use that. So in terms of trying to figure out which trials are the best to accept, we had to do some assessment of what would benefit our current as well as future patients, which is not something we're typically in the market to do, right? So we often consider whether the risk versus the benefit of an individual trial makes sense for participants. But here we actually had to try to figure out which trials were the most promising based on some or no previous data. That's hard. So a couple of things that we took into consideration. One is sort of the complexity of not just deciding which trials to choose, but running them at the same time in the same institution. So this is a picture of the University of Michigan indoor track. And I am using it because we were on the precipice of changing that into a field hospital when the surge went down in Michigan. So the plans are ready if we need it again in the future, but to convert this indoor track to a field hospital. So this was one of the things that we were taking in consideration as we were planning clinical trials, because if half of our COVID patients are off-site in a track, and some of our COVID patients are in a RICU, and some of our COVID patients are in a hallway in an emergency department, how do we offer consistency in the clinical trials when our patients are spread out in such a complex fashion? The second major issue that everyone has to take into consideration is the virulence and transmissibility of COVID-19, particularly in the context of the fact that we keep learning more and more about how it's transmitted. And every day we know a little bit more, but at the beginning of this, we're all very concerned about physical contact and not touching things. And now we're sort of moved to more concerns about airborne particles, but we know it's extremely virulent, and sort of how do you take that into account when designing trials and keeping your team safe? And then the third issue is exacerbation of existing health disparities. So I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail. So when we were trying to prioritize between clinical trials, one of the main questions is the scientific plausibility sufficient to justify testing in these very ill and vulnerable patients? Second, we wanted to sort of diversify our portfolio somewhat of the kinds of trials that we were offering, right? So we wanted to ensure that not only were we emphasizing phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, but we were doing trials for different kinds of interventions. And there are a lot of considerations, and again, you can go to the article for more, but a last one that I'll talk about here is if there's overlap and inclusion criteria between trials, how do you decide which participant goes to what? In terms of the transmissibility, so as I mentioned, under our general criteria for IRB approval of research, we're usually used to balancing the potential risks of the trial against the potential benefits of a single patient. And that often is complex enough, but we have an N of one, like we have one interested party and we're trying to balance the risk for that one person. However, in the context of COVID, we also have to take into account risks to the study team as well, right? And those might or might not be different than risks we're willing to take on for the clinical team. And also if the study team is taking away PPE from the clinical team, or faculty, or staff, or other kinds of resources. So we wanted to ensure that teams that were proposing COVID trials didn't just have experience with clinical trials, but had experience with infectious disease clinical trials and some of the special procedures we were going to have to undergo, and ways to minimize contact. So as an example, FDA allowing for e-consent was a big deal, and that was something that we rolled out very quickly at the University of Michigan as well. So probably the most important component of these issues is the exacerbation of health disparities. So this is Michigan data. So you can see race on the left-hand column and cases and then deceased. And you can see that there are a lot of disparities in terms of cases with African-American patients. 32% of our patients with COVID were African-American, and 41% of patients statewide that died of COVID were African-American. And in particular, the blue circle, so this map data is actually just from yesterday. So this is Michigan on the uptick again. The blue circle is surrounding Detroit, which has the most active cases right now. And you can see as the counties go out and out now from Detroit, they generally get lighter. So that's our current situation. And just to sort of in comparison to the baseline population, you can see here that while again, 32% of our COVID patients are Black and 41% of deaths are in Black patients, Black citizens only make up 14% of the state of Michigan. So that is an enormous discrepancy. So in terms of establishing a recruitment process, one of the things that was initially advocated in particular by our clinicians, which makes total sense. So clinicians are not used to thinking in terms of research ethics or public health ethics, right? They are there to take care of their patients. And so many of them came to the table, understandably, with the thought that, well, patients have autonomy and patients have choice, and that's how we honor their autonomy. So we did consider giving patients a choice of RCTs to which they qualified. But there were a couple of reasons that we decided not to do that. One is we thought it sort of conflated the idea of efficacy and equipoise. So one, we already struggle, meaning everyone already struggles with therapeutic misconception, and patients who are recruited into research protocols in particular, misunderstanding, thinking the research protocol might help them when often there's equipoise and we don't actually know whether the trial is going to help them or not. And we thought that if patients were given a choice of clinical trial, that would really exacerbate that issue, because it would imply that we knew something about what was best and we could tailor which trial was best for their personal goals of care. So those are the two. So that was that issue that we considered. The other issue is sort of the challenges of comprehension of complex clinical trials, right? So first, any communication is already severely impaired by the airborne isolation protocols. You know, patients are most often in a room by themselves, and or the study team and clinicians are all behind their PPE, and it makes it really hard to communicate. Also, often when we're recruiting acutely ill patients into clinical trials, really the conversation is with their friends and family and their caretakers, but this was not something that was possible at our hospital, and I'm sure many hospitals across the country, because we did not allow visitors into the RICU except for at the end of life. And then, you know, as we know from many studies, I've done some, many people have done them, our patients are often challenged to understand research protocols when we try to recruit them as participants. When you do comprehension tests after, they often don't even understand the details of one, let alone several to choose from in an acute care situation. And then the other thing that I had a lot of concern about was potential skewing in our demographics if we give patients the choice because of the politicalization of many of the options. And, you know, as we know, people who consume different types of news often have very different demographics. And if one set of news was recommending one drug and the other set of news was recommending another drug, there were some concerns that that might actually skew our results around along the lines of demographics. So those are the reasons that we went towards a more, so it's not randomized, we're calling it sort of clinical, we're trying to clinically match patients to the appropriate trial. So how that has played out is that generally patients have only met the inclusion criteria for only one, maybe two clinical trials right now at the University of Michigan, and thus far, everybody who met the criteria for two clinical trials, there was some reason on the basis of their underlying medical condition that based on potential side effects of the trials, one was clinically more appropriate than the other. However, when and if the time comes that that isn't the case, we are considering potentially doing a A day, B day, and recruiting people for different trials that way. And if somebody declines the first trial, the next day they could be approached for the trial that we're recruiting for that day. And that's described in more detail in our publication as well. So the last issue that I'm going to talk a little bit about before we turn the floor over for questions is drug access, because that has really compounded, I think, a lot of the disparities and confusion, especially for drugs that are not available clinically, meaning they're not otherwise available to be prescribed off-label. So as an example, hydroxychloroquine, as we know, is currently approved for lupus and therefore can be prescribed off-label for COVID. But it's particularly hard for drugs that are not otherwise accessible clinically. And so just as an example of what we're doing at the University of Michigan, so we set out this sort of flow chart to sort of help us understand all of the different pathways and to be able to put somebody in charge of all of the different pathways through which we can access drug. So, you know, the first question is, what kind of an intervention are we considering? And we differentiated it into clinical and research interventions. And yes, this is maize and blue at the University of Michigan. We try to always be really on point with style. But so we divided them into clinical and research. And then, so in terms of clinical, we actually had a standardized practice guideline 6 weeks into the pandemic. So we had an SPG for people to follow in terms of clinical care. But you can also get expanded access directly from Gilead, and I'll talk about that in a minute, as well as emergency use authorization. And those are all considered under the umbrella of clinical access. And then we also had access to some drugs via clinical trials. And I am going to use remdesivir as the example to sort of walk us through some of the complications of this, because it is available through the EA and EUA and clinical trials and not off-label clinically. And so in terms of where we're getting the product, so remdesivir is not available clinically to us through, you can't just write a script and have remdesivir appear from your hospital pharmacy. And the EA program is through Gilead. The EUA program is through the federal stockpile, and the clinical trials, the drug is coming from Gilead. So let me talk a little bit more about that and why that is so important. So I'm going to focus on those. And I think really the important component of this is the sort of inequity in access to remdesivir with all of these different pathways. So we already know that there's a lot of inequity in access through traditional clinical care, both in terms of accessing healthcare professionals in a timely fashion and having your concerns listened to. So there's all sorts of structural inequities in healthcare that we are already aware of, but I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of more unique structural inequities with remdesivir. So the first pathway is expanded access. And so Gilead started out, so expanded access is a pathway, for those of you who don't know, when a patient doesn't have access to a clinical trial of the drug or a comparable drug, but sort of it's the last shot that they have at, because they might have already used all of the standard therapeutics at, alleviating their condition. So Gilead started out with an individual expanded access program, which means that doctors had to call and ask for product for one specific patient. So soon that became untenable, as you can imagine, to do it patient by patient. So Gilead instead turned its focus to setting up expanded access programs with institutions and still allowing for expanded access for pregnant patients and pediatric patients who were excluded from the clinical trials. So now what they're doing is an EA program with these other two kinds of exceptions for individuals. But EA programs have to be negotiated at the institutional level. And we at the University of Michigan, we have a team of about 5 people that are involved in that. And one person who that is her primary occupation is ensuring EA access and facilitating doctors and pharmaceutical companies to come together to help patients. And that is not the case at the vast majority of even well-funded hospitals, let alone other hospitals and local hospitals. So in terms of randomized clinical trials, so that's the Hopkins map of current cases. In terms of RCTs, one example I want to give is something that I think we really need to be cognizant about is a lot of the facially neutral standards that we're writing into all sorts of things might actually really have disparate impacts. So as an example, using Gilead and remdesivir, so an exclusion criteria for the remdesivir RCT is severe kidney disease. That makes a lot of sense medically because one of the adverse events from remdesivir can be kidney damage. And also one thing that can happen when you're very sick with COVID is you can get kidney damage and end up on dialysis. And so it makes a lot of sense that if Gilead is trying to assess which adverse effects are related to the drug rather than the disease, they would want to take out the population of patients who have pre-existing severe kidney disease. However, Black patients are actually 4 times as likely to have underlying kidney disease conditions and are also 5 times as likely to be hospitalized with COVID in the first place. So already we're eradicating through otherwise facially neutral exclusion criteria one of the populations that's being most affected by this disease. And so it's even more important that our Black patients have access to remdesivir through other pathways because, as we know, it's currently the most promising drug. I also want to highlight that if the RCTs are being conducted by major academic medical centers and populations that are populated, those major medical centers are more likely to be white, we can end up in disparities in the data that we're generating from those trials as well. And while there's no indication that it would affect different races differently, COVID specifically, because of existing structural racism and inequities. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this a lot more next time with Rakaya and Seema, because everything I know about this, I read in their last excellent law review. But if some of our patients are going back to situations where their health are compounded by living conditions and working conditions and existing inequities in access to healthcare, that might really affect how effective some of these therapeutics are for them. And so we really need to ensure that we're getting diversity in our data as well. And then last, sort of the other main pathway for remdesivir is emergency use authorization. And so this is for when you don't have access to a clinical trial or an expanded access program. Some hospitals were left to rely on the EUA program to access remdesivir. So this is the drug that's not coming from Gilead. This is the drug that's actually coming from the feds and through the federal stockpile. And as you probably know, there was a lot of confusion in terms of where that was distributed. It was distributed at the state level in some states. It was distributed at the hospital level in other states. It was distributed sometimes to hospitals that didn't actually have any COVID patients. It was a bit haphazard, and you could see where that would be particularly concerning at institutions that didn't otherwise have access to the drug. And also, even when it was being distributed through the state level, it wasn't necessarily clear with how we were supposed to allocate our limited remdesivir. So as an example, the original Michigan EUA said that the remdesivir was to be distributed to the sickest patients first. However, there was already indication at that time that it would probably be most effective in patients who weren't as sick. So there was a lot of confusion there too. So you can see how these access pathways can and do further compound our existing disparities that we already had with COVID. So obviously, I'm not going to solve these problems for us. And I would refer to a lot of really excellent literature that's being generated by many of our colleagues actually in this interest group, but just some overarching points to consider. One, I want to highlight the piece that was posted yesterday by Holly, Patty, Steve, and Emily and their colleagues regarding regulatory flexibility for COVID-19 research. The link is there. I think that that was a really good one that went through a lot of the practical suggestions of requirements that should be sort of loosened or waived by FDA to ensure that we are enrolling diverse participants in the most efficient and effective way possible. So I would definitely recommend that. The second thing that I had said a lot at my institution is that, and we talked about a little bit at the beginning, is this transition that's really hard for clinicians to make from clinical ethics to public health or research, to thinking in the framework of public health or research ethics. You know, our clinicians generally, if they have formal training in ethics, it's clinical ethics, and they are just so used to, rightly, respecting the autonomy of individuals and putting their patient first. And so both because of this training, but also because it's more fair for our clinicians who are actually trying to make these decisions, we need to really take them out of the hands of the individual clinicians who are trying to treat individual patients and take these decisions away from the bedside and instead make them at the systemic level. It can also help control for either implicit or explicit biases in any clinicians, as well as sort of systemic biases, right? Because even if you have two clinicians who are not otherwise biased in how they're treating their own patients, at the systems level, we could be biased because this doctor might see these kinds of patients and that doctor might see those kinds of patients, right? So we have to be concerned about building in biases at all of these levels. And then also, and again, you guys are going to hear a lot more about this next time, but you know, trying not to further compound existing racial disparities in this virus is something that everybody needs to be thinking about every day with every step, right? How are our facially neutral protocols actually affecting our patients in disparate ways? As an example, I've heard some suggestions at other institutions about oversampling patients more likely to be affected by COVID and clinical trials. But of course, if we don't actually know whether the clinical trial is going to do more harm than good, it might actually not be a benefit, right, to oversample. So we need to be concerned about this on both ends. And then also, and this has been said before, but I will say it again because it's so critical, in particular, if our patients, as I mentioned in the state of Michigan, our patients are more likely to be Black, they're overrepresented than in our baseline population, we have to ensure, so we're in Washtenaw County, the University of Michigan, so we are further out from that really dark bubble, if you remember the way the state of Michigan looked. we need to ensure that anything that we find out works, any advances, actually get back to the community from whom we recruited our participants, right? We need to make sure that our patient's mom or brother or father, when they walk in the door at their local hospital, they have access to the care that their family member contributed to. And that is a long-term research ethics issue, but I think it's particularly important to repeat here. So that is the overview of the prepared remarks I wanted to make. And I think we have plenty of time for Q&A.
All right, thank you so much. That was great. I have one question that has come in through here about remdesivir. They wanted to know, and I think you touched on this, is there an actual policy for its distribution and availability right now? I know you mentioned Gilead's EA program. Is there anything more than that, or?
Yeah, so I don't know what the next round of EUA remdesivir is going to look like from the feds. I hope there were a lot of lessons learned in the last round. I think the most important lesson learned was that it makes sense to distribute it to the states and let the states allocate as they see fit among community hospitals. This is complex. There was a point at which Michigan's allocation of remdesivir got tied into some of our public health executive orders, which further complicates things. The remdesivir emergency expanded access that's coming from Gilead itself. So it's, as I mentioned, it's being compiled into programs right now. I know a little bit less about that because Michigan actually doesn't, despite Michigan having one of the largest expanded access programs in the country, we actually don't have an expanded access remdesivir program because we have one of the remdesivir clinical trials and expanded access programs are for people who don't otherwise have access to RCTs. So I don't think there's a right answer to that question because it's very different depending which pathway, and it continues to change. And another thing I will say is the emergency use authorization, it didn't start until May 1st, right? And on May 1st, we were already 3.5 months into the pandemic and we're already up to almost 10,000 deaths. And so if you were at an institution that didn't have the resources to negotiate for either to support a randomized clinical trial or negotiate for an expanded access program, you were out of luck in terms of access to remdesivir.
Okay, let's see. We have another question here. How do we balance the cost effectiveness and scarcity when some resources like remdesivir are shown to be more effective in the less sick and the literature is limited and ever evolving? I'm
sorry, how do we balance, can you say that one more time?
Sure, cost effectiveness and scarcity of resources like remdesivir. When there's some evidence that has shown that that drug is more effective in the less sick, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that we grappled with at the University of Michigan because we had emergency use remdesivir. So an overarching thing, so I don't have a perfect solution to it. An overarching thing I will say is that I think we as a bioethics community have put a lot of time and effort into vent allocation. And I think to some extent, that's appropriate because it's important, but vent allocation decisions have been happening at a much lower rate than all of these other kinds of scarce resource allocation decisions. And it's sort of the difference between explicit and implicit rationing, right? So at the University of Michigan, we have a very explicit policy on vent allocation. But I know that we and many other institutions have really focused on sort of the hottest topic of vent allocation, which is also something, quite frankly, that the community can process better as well. So people sort of get the problem with vent allocation. And we're leaving all of these smaller implicit rationing decisions to individual clinicians at the bedside. And it's not like because we don't have an explicit policy on how to allocate something, it's not being allocated. It is, but it's getting allocated by individuals. And it's unfair to them because they're supposed to be focusing on clinical care. And it's potentially very unfair to patients because it might get spread out in disparate ways. So that doesn't obviously solve the problem of exactly how we allocate resources. And I think that there is some really excellent literature out there by Valerie Gutman-Koch and others spanning the decades on allocation of scarce resources. But the point I want to make is during COVID, I don't want us to think that just because we don't have an explicit rationing protocol about something that we're not rationing, because we're rationing all the time.
Okay, another question here I have is, are the RCTs of remdesivir still placebo controlled? If so, how are the decisions made about patient access to RCT? In which case, who may get placebo versus EA versus EUA?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So again, who gets what in the control arm is a long-standing research ethics issue. Currently, I believe at least ours, if not all of the trials, have been switched over to a design where both the active and the control are receiving remdesivir. And what we're comparing is dosage, time, and length, and sort of different ways of allocating the drug to an individual patient, but everybody's getting the drug. I think an important question that people are grappling with is if some patients qualify for the remdesivir clinical trial, but decline to enroll in it, should they then have access to the EUA remdesivir? If the EUA remdesivir is the only kind of remdesivir, other patients who might be suffering from kidney disease, as an example, have access to, and the prioritization there. And actually, Holly has an interesting article forthcoming in AJOB on just that topic too.
Okay. How risky are the various types of expedited research models? Can you address the concern of health data privacy and commercialization of patient data?
Yeah, so there's two kinds, well, there's a lot of issues, but I'll break it down into two kinds of issues. There's data from the trial itself in the EMR, and then there's data from all of these other commercial entities, right? So there's data that might be commercialized, and there's data that are coming in as commercial data. So as to the latter, many states have been setting up these COVID contact tracing apps where a person either through their sort of ongoing GPS monitoring or through checking in and sort of say where they've been and what they've done. And then if a positive case has been reported in the CVS where they were yesterday at the same time, they can sort of automatically be notified that they should self-quarantine. This has not had federal leadership, so has been done state by state, and in some states hasn't even had really state leadership in terms of which apps the state is going to support and work with. And so in some states, like 4 or 5 app choices are available to citizens. And so if everybody's using these different apps, they're not going to be helpful. You know, some people aren't even using them. If everyone's using different apps, they're not going to be helpful. In terms of commercializing the data coming out of the COVID trials, I mean, they're industry-sponsored trials, right? So there's a difference between when academic medical centers run their own trials, either through NIH funding or their own funds, and then sell the data and specimens. But it's important to note that if Gilead is running the trial at your institution, which it currently is, like, it is commercial from the get-go. And there has been a lot of reports about the former issue, institutions commercializing otherwise academic data. But we also should acknowledge the fact that academic institutions have neither the funds nor the structure to bring drugs and devices to market. We need to pair with pharmaceutical companies. So I think it is either more or less complicated, depending how you're thinking about it, the issue of commercialization in this.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, I got another question just came through. Which is better? One, a facially neutral policy that leads to greater total health outcomes for the population, for example, number of lives saved, or two, a facially non-neutral policy that, let's see, leads to greater racial parity, but lesser total health outcomes for the population?
So that is a big question that I cannot answer. Because there's so many things going on in that question, right? And it is so context specific. I will say that there are some really interesting pieces drilling down on this issue, specifically in vent allocation. And so you should go and read some of those pieces, because there are some arguments for allocating more vents on the basis of race and ethnicity. So there are other people who have discussed that, who focus on those issues, so I would defer to them. The warning I was trying to make for us is that we shouldn't assume just because language or policies are facially neutral, like we didn't intentionally build in racism to our structure. We're like, oh, it doesn't say race anywhere. We need to be aware that we live in a system which has deep set structural inequities to begin with, such that it's not good enough anymore, or it's not good enough ever, just to write something that looks facially neutral, because it actually, when applied, might go out and compound health disparities. So as an example, because I'm in the OB/GYN department, these are the examples I know best, but like our first labor and delivery visitor policy was that women could, the father could be in the room with the mom during labor and delivery. But then of course we immediately realized that, you know, not everybody shows up with a presumptive father of the baby. And should women who don't present with a father not have a support person? So I think that that's sort of a concrete example of something that obviously nobody intended to be applied in a disparate way, but immediately was clear was having a disparate impact.
I mean, just a general question. You know, there's been so much awareness of health disparities in medicine lately, and there's a lot of discussion about this with COVID. Do you feel like in general, a lot of research institutions are taking that into account when making their trials, or doing a good job of it? I mean, we know there's greater awareness, but how much of a problem do you still think it is, or just where do you think it's at, just generally?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that increasingly the ethics literature is doing a better job of at least sort of acknowledging and attempting to build that perspective into pieces. I think that that can be improved. It's very hard to comment on how much a role that's playing on individual institutions where I'm not in the room. Having been in the room in many of the conversations at Michigan, you know, I know that that's one of the primary concerns that keeps coming up. But as to the 2 questions ago question, then what, right? So it's hard enough to get systems to be self-aware of structural inequities, but even when they are, it's not always clear the correct response to either alleviate or not compound those inequities. So, yeah, so while at least in the literature that I have read, I have seen an increased awareness of that issue. And at my institution, there has been an increased awareness. I cannot speak to other institutions, and I don't know that we're actually accomplishing anything.
Okay. Let's see, another question here. How have you handled the individual versus population-based approaches with clinicians? Do you have any challenges and solutions that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I think it's sad that I don't have a whiteboard. I should make my Zoom background a whiteboard, because I feel like every Zoom meeting I'm in, at some point we get to the conversation where I'm like, Okay, so bioethics is the umbrella, and then there's a Venn diagram of public health ethics and research ethics and clinical ethics, and they have a lot of overlap, but they have some differences in where we emphasize different kinds of principles, and we need to be concerned about community. So it's probably obnoxious, but that's how I often do it. And I will say that, you know, clinicians are focusing rightly on the best way to clinically help our COVID patients, right? They're not necessarily, some of them are, but they're not necessarily going home at night and reading, you know, law reviews or excellent books that have been written about sort of structural racism in healthcare throughout the centuries. And so I at least have found in my experience that if I can mention these concepts, people are generally very open to them. And then I send articles and I'm like, here, you know, read this by Rakaya, here, read this by Dorothy Roberts. And generally, the clinicians that I'm working with have been very open to reconsidering things in different structures because they're there to help patients. I'm there to help patients. And I think both of us can do it better together. So that's not going to work for everybody all the time, but I think having people like us, you know, people who are focused in other disciplines and have different kinds of backgrounds and have different books on our shelves behind us are helpful to those conversations.
Another question here. How's the media's handling of drug efficacy, for example, the hydroxychloroquine mixed messaging, impacted drug trials? Are there reassurances that there won't be politicization of decisions? So, yeah, media is handling.
I have no reassurance that there won't be politicalization of decisions moving forward. No.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably right.
I mean, that would be great.
Sure.
The first step is always self-awareness. So actually, if I go back, I have a citation that you guys can read at the bottom of this. So the second one, the JAMA letter of internet searches for unproven COVID-19 therapies, that actually sort of goes more into detail about the spikes in searches for hydroxychloroquine. And also that couple, you know, where the husband ended up dying after eating the fish food was like 2 days after Trump made the announcement. So there has been some good work sort of quantifying the effect of the news media, but I have no assurance that that effect is going to die down.
Yeah. Let's see. Lynette, do you have any other questions? I don't think I see any others coming in. If anybody has anything else.
I think we've pretty much covered a lot of material here. My question was really just going back to sort of equipoise, and I think sort of the relaying information back to clinicians and how to advocate for treatments that are effective. Do you have any insights on how that could be most effective? Because what's coming out from the general media is one thing, and might be coming out of RCTs and academic institutions might not necessarily be the same thing. How do you ensure that what the information that clinicians are getting is accurate?
Yeah, so I would like to think that there is a culture among clinicians to get their medical information from the peer-reviewed literature rather than the news media. That said, as we all know, there have also been some pretty substantial hiccups in the peer-reviewed literature with some pretty colossal retractions by Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. So that is an imperfect system as well. Yeah, again, like these are big, hard questions to which there's no right answer because each state, each hospital, each clinician is so different. Another thing that I will say, which I understand, but as a lawyer makes me uncomfortable whenever I see it, is the amount of information going around on Twitter between like sometimes very reputable doctors caring for COVID patients in ICUs or elsewhere. And it underscores for me the need for rapid sharing of data. But on the other hand, when people have rapidly shared data in preprints, and even in the New England Journal of Medicine, sometimes it's not correct. And so I think that that is an issue that science and medicine is going to have to grapple with substantially more going forward. We are not currently in a world where we can do cancer research for 8 years. It has to move faster than that, but how do we move faster and still ensure the validity of the data is a big, hard question that I think we're still struggling with.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on a lot of the retractions and some of the information coming out. One of the criticisms has been, especially in the arena for vaccines, that, oh, one day you say one thing, another day, and it's just constant evolving of
the Fauci argument.
Yeah, that's coming out.
Right.
And, and it's being used as ammunition against science and to sort of, imply this sort of distrust towards science in general, right? Like that's kind of what everyone's kind of grappling with on sort of this larger level.
Yeah.
And I think, from your research, do you have any, and this is more of like your opinion, right? Like this is just what you feel.
Right, I was gonna say, I don't know that.
there's
my opinion as a citizen.
Do you have any sort of insight on those larger questions that sort of not necessarily are specifically related to RCTs and clinical ethics, but, sort of the overarching questions of our time right now, and especially in light of COVID?
Mm-hmm. Man, way to take it easy on me, Lynette. So I have colleagues that are trust scholars and focus on issues of trust. That has never been as appealing to me as a methodology, because I don't fully, and this may very well be a limitation of my education, but I don't fully understand trust as an objective metric and understand fully how to measure it across communities. To me, and so that is a professional observation, and I guess as a personal observation, I don't think the underlying political issue is that Dr. Fauci didn't recommend masks at first and is now recommending masks. I don't think that that is a problem. That is the problem. I think that that is a symptom of the problem. And I think that the actual problem has been the politicalization of healthcare since, for the past decade and a half. It's not immediately clear to me why access to healthcare has become such a partisan issue, but it has. And that has permeated everything from the biggest decisions down to the smallest decisions, in terms of, wearing a mask for 5 minutes when you run in and out of the grocery store. I think that that is a systemic problem, not a specific problem. So I don't think the problem is that people don't trust the government anymore because Dr. Fauci said one thing at the beginning and said something else at the end, when there's obviously clear reasons for that. I think the problem is structural and unfortunately is harder than just clarifying or resolving that issue.
And also maybe to your point that it is a process and it's iterative, and it's the information coming out, it's a novel virus, we're learning as we go along. One of the questions actually asked if we're kind of colloquially kind of going through this by the seat of our pants, right? But that's just the nature of research, and researching a novel virus. A lot of the information will constantly, rapidly evolve. And I think being allowed that space to adjust and learn and accommodate as need be as the information becomes available is part of the process, right? Like in research.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, although I will push back a little bit just in terms of there has also been a breakdown of announcements of best practices at the federal level, right? Or even the state level. Even I, as an avid, obsessive consumer of COVID information, feel like I'm making these decisions on the basis of various things that happen to pass my desk. And I am increasingly skeptical of recommendations that are coming down from on high about whether they are politically motivated or motivated by what's in the best interest of public health. So I think, yes, you are entirely right that one of our challenges is this is a rapidly evolving disease in terms of information that we have about it. But I think that is being very much compounded, again, by the underlying issue of that health has become very political.
Great, thank you. And many thanks to everyone for joining us today. It was a terrific talk. Thank you to Professor Spector for her insights. If you do have more questions that you're mulling through and you didn't get a chance to ask them and you'd like to continue the conversation, I think we're always happy to entertain that over Twitter or engage with Professor Spector either through email or Twitter as well. We are back.
Yeah, don't call me, I'm not in my office.
We are back in about 2 weeks, July 29th, and that's Wednesday, July 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern, with our second part of public health law and ethics. Many of you have been asking about the availability and accessibility of this series that we've been hosting for the past few weeks. This will be our final webinar for this COVID-19 series, but we will be posting all of these recordings in a Dropbox and it's free and accessible for any ASBH member. So be sure to register in advance for any of the webinars, or actually the last webinar we'll be hosting, at least for the time being. And send us any questions you may have, potential future webinars. You know, some of you have reached out to suggest future topics that we might be able to host. And with that being said, thanks again, everyone, and have a great remainder of your day and continue to be safe and well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.